现在我们正式开启大会的主旨演讲环节，让我们用最热烈的掌声欢迎三大洲社会研究所所长 Vijay Prashad，Welcome。
Good morning. I'll give a few seconds for people to take their seats, get their translation devices back.
Very nice.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. It's really great to co-organize this forum with Professor Liu Xinyu from East China Normal University. She and I just went with a group of other people to Rongjiang, where I was able to get this fabulous coat. And on the side of the coat is a phoenix rising from the ashes, like all of humanity. Thanks a lot to my co-organizer, Professor Liu Xinyu. In early August 1942, the Soviets set up loudspeakers across Leningrad. The city had been under siege for over 300 days. People had been starving. The conductor, Karl Eliasberg, kept the Leningrad radio orchestra. He kept it going by holding rehearsals and personally taking his musicians to feeding stations. On 9th August, Eliasberg collected the 15 survivors of the Leningrad Radio Orchestra and brought in some members of the military bands to the Bolshoi Philharmonic Hall. They performed Dmitri Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7, or Leningrad, over the radio and through the public loudspeakers. The symphony is in 4 parts. The first part, pastoral, reveals Leningrad before the war. The second, a snare drum with its tempo increasing, refers to the Nazi invasion. The third movement is strings and wind instruments, a lament for the terrible suffering of the Soviet citizens, millions already dead or dying. The final movement was in C major, loud and proud, a victory that they anticipated would take place against the evil of fascism. They did not know it yet, but they were less than halfway through the siege. They had 536 more days of starvation and battle ahead of them. It says something about the sheer grit of the Soviet citizenry that they would perform the symphony in the midst of the siege and that they would perform it so that the loudspeakers pointed at the Nazi lines and so that the Germans could hear it too. In the Soviet archive, there is a sentence written by an intelligence officer. Even the enemy listened in silence. They knew it was our victory over despair. Later, a German prisoner said that the symphony was a ghost from the city we could not kill. Not only did the Nazis fail to kill the city, but they soon found that the Red Army could break through their lines in January 1944 and then rush across Ukraine, Poland, across the Oder River and into Berlin by the 2nd of May 1945. In that miraculous rush across Eastern Europe, the Soviet army destroyed 80% of the Wehrmacht, which is what our study shows. By the time that the Western armies came near the borders of Germany, the Nazi regime had already collapsed. It was the Soviet Red Army that liberated most of the people in the concentration camps, and it was the scientific manner of the advance of the Red Army that forced the Nazi allies in Eastern Europe, such as the Romanians, to surrender and change sides. The reason that the Soviet Union was able to marshal all its strength against the Nazis was that in its eastern flank, the Chinese communists and patriots defended the USSR from attack by the Japanese militarists. Fighting with inadequate arms, the Chinese communists and patriots defended the USSR. They inflicted enormous damage on the Japanese forces, tying down 60% of the Japanese army and preventing it from facing the onrush of US troops that went from island to island in the Pacific. If the Chinese had not held down the Japanese troops, then both the USSR would have fallen, and so Nazi Germany would have seized Europe, and the US troops would not have prevailed in the battles of Saipan in 1944 and Iwo Jima in 1945. For the Soviet Red Army to destroy 80% of the German armed forces, and for the Chinese communists and patriots to tie down 60% of the Japanese forces, the two together sacrificed tens of millions of lives. In this study, we have the full calculation. You can go between 50 million dead and 100 million dead, depending on how you calculate it. By May 1945, when the Nazi regime collapsed, it was already clear that the path for the Japanese was towards surrender. It was unnecessary for the United States to conduct the Trinity tests in July 1945 and then to drop the atom bombs on Hiroshima on the 6th of August and Nagasaki on the 9th of August. The immense sacrifice of the Soviet citizens, the Chinese communists, and the Chinese patriots made the use of that weapon of mass destruction preventable. That they used it, that the imperialists used it, tells us more about the violent disregard for human life that defines imperialist culture, which is exactly what we are seeing today in Gaza. The first lie, that the Western allies opposed the fascists from the first, and that it was the Western allies that won the war against fascism. That's, by the way, what you learn when you watch a Hollywood film about World War II. It's always somebody from Iowa landing at Normandy who leads the charge to Berlin. That's the first lie. The Western governments across the North Atlantic region sent their armies to destroy the October Revolution from the moment that it began in 1917. The Soviet government sued for peace in December 1917, but Germany nonetheless attacked Finland and the young Soviet Republic, which then faced an Allied invasion from troops descending upon it from the United States, United Kingdom, France, Romania, Estonia, Greece, Australia, Canada, Japan, and Italy. The attitude of the Allies is clear from the writings and speeches of British Premier Winston Churchill, who said in 1919 that the Allies should destroy the foul baboonery of Bolshevism. 30 years later, he said that the strangling of Bolshevism at its birth would have been an untold blessing to the human race. In the 1930s and 1940s, the Western governments wanted the fascist regimes of Germany and Italy to turn their guns against the Soviet Union and destroy it. That was what appeasement meant. Not that the Western governments appeased Hitler, but that they agreed with Hitler's anti-communism and allowed his military build-up if it focused on the USSR. Although the British and French declared war on Germany in September 1931, in the months ahead, they did nothing, which is why this period is known as the phony war, or the Drôle de Guerre, as the Sitzkrieg. They sat on the war, the Sitzkrieg, a play on the German word Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Hitler's armies invaded the USSR in 1941. The Western countries waited for 3 years before opening up the Second Front in 1944. The only reason that the Western countries entered the war was that it appeared to them that the Red Army was going to charge into Germany and would then hold the central country in Europe, and that perhaps the partisans in Yugoslavia would take Yugoslavia and that the Greek communists would take Greece. At the Tehran Conference of 1943, the United States and United Kingdom had to acknowledge that it was the Red Army that destroyed fascism. Churchill gave Stalin a sword made of Sheffield steel and presented to him on behalf of King George IV. The sword was called the Sword of Stalingrad to commemorate the terrible courage of the Soviet citizens, 2 million of them, who withstood the siege and beat the Nazis. 2 million died. But it still took the Allies, after Tehran, another year before they entered the war in Europe, by which time the German military had decimated had been decimated by the Red Army. For the Western governments, the principal contradiction was not between liberalism and fascism. It was the imperialist or war camp, which included both the fascists and the liberals, against the socialist or peace camp. This contradiction ran from 1917 to 1991, right through the years of the Second World War and the Cold War. The second lie, that it was the US sacrifices in the Pacific War and then the US nuclear bombs that defeated Japanese militarism. The Second World War did not begin in 1939 when Germany invaded Austria. It began 2 years earlier in China at the time of the Marco Polo Bridge incident and continued, if we are to be accurate, right through the war against Korea that closed with an armistice in 1953. Millions of patriotic people fought against Japanese militarism, which drew in the worst of the far right in Korea and Indochina. But at the same time, drawing in hundreds of thousands of brave anti-fascists into the struggle. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, 10 years later, the Chinese patriots and communists, as well as armies of national liberation fighters in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, tied down the Japanese troops, with 60% of them weakened by that bravery, and with the Japanese unable to attack the rear flank of the Soviets. And during this period, the Allies provided petroleum and steel to the Japanese war machine. Hard to forget the immense sacrifices of the 100 Regiments Offensive in 1940, with 400,000 communist troops led by General Tudor, that destroyed the Japanese infrastructure in northern China, including 900 kilometers of railroad line. The mythography of the US Marine clambering up into the heights of Iwo Jima, or the atom bomb cowering the Japanese into surrender, is almost complete. It does not matter that the Japanese had already been substantially beaten and were prepared to surrender, or that neither Hiroshima nor Nagasaki were military targets. What happened in August 1945 was not about military strategy. It was entirely a demonstration of US power, a message to the world about the new weapon that the United States had developed, and a warning to the communists in Asia that this weapon could be used against them. The millions of Asian workers and peasants that died to defeat fascism, including my own family members in Burma, were erased by the mushroom cloud. It began to take precedence in popular memory. The bomb, and not the people who fought for each inch of land across Southeast Asia, became the hero. That is the second lie. Amidst these two lies is an associated lie, a lie that is buried in our popular memory. Fascism is the negation of sovereignty and dignity. In fact, fascism resembles colonialism and is its ugly twin. It is hard to distinguish between fascism and colonialism, for after all, the suppression of sovereignty and dignity is the essence of colonialism. And during colonial rule, genocide was indeed a punctual feature. Consider the 6 million people at least killed in the Congo, and the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples of Southwest Africa by Germany, or indeed the genocide of the native peoples in the Americas, and the 3 million Bengalis starved to death in 1943. That is the reason why, after the defeat of German fascism and Japanese militarism, the Dutch, the French, and the British, with their US allies, returned to claim their colonies respectively in Indonesia, Indochina, and Malaya. The violence in these colonial wars in the 1940s and 1950s grotesque. Of the Dutch attempt to recolonize Indonesia, the nationalist leader Sukarno said, "They call it police action, but our villages burn, our people die, and our nation bleeds for its freedom." Chin Peng, a Malay communist, said something similar. "We rose up because we saw villages starve, voices silenced by money and power." General Sir Gerald Templer, who ran the so-called British emergency in Malaya, said after a rebellion that it was a village of 5,000 cowards, and he allowed the villagers to starve to death by denying them rice. Villages burnt, villagers starved. That was the reality of the attempted reconquest of the colonies and then of the US war on Korea. When the United States began its operations in Korea, President Harry Truman said that his army should use every weapon that we have. A chilling comment given the use of nuclear bombs on Japan. But there was no need for an atom bomb when the aerial bombardment just vanished the cities of northern Korea. Major General Rosie O'Donnell told the US Senate in 1951, "Everything is destroyed. There is nothing left standing worthy of that name. There were no more targets in Korea." This was the attitude. Fascism or colonialism, take your pick. And the Western colonialists resurrected the fascistic elements in Japan, Korea, Indochina, and other countries to ally them against the workers and the peasants as well as the communists. That reveals that the Western colonialists were not anti-fascist at all. Their real enemy was the possibility that the workers and peasants would build their clarity and confidence and that they would opt for a socialist future. The enormous truth is that it was the Soviet Red Army and the Chinese communists and patriots that actually defeated Nazi Germany and militarist Japan. It was these forces that sacrificed the most against fascism, and it was these forces that understood the intimate relationship between fascism, capitalism, and colonialism. One cannot be an anti-fascist and be for colonialism or for capitalism. That is simply impossible. These are antithetical formations. My mind is still in Leningrad in August 1942. Remember the orchestra and Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. The Nazi troops are around the city. Everything is silent. Then the music begins. It continues for an hour. Let us return to Leningrad, to August 1942. Only briefly, but let us begin with that. What I presented today, two lies and one great truth, is not just a speech. It represents a serious piece of academic research. To further excavate and arm ourselves with facts in pursuit of the truth about who saved humanity and who will continue to fight to save humanity. Tricontinental Institute for Social Research is really proud to officially release this 45,000-word report that everybody has in their bag. This work is by no means the result of one person's effort. It is a great honor to invite to the stage three comrades who contributed immensely to the publication of this report. First, of course, Professor Liu Xinyu, Chair of the Global South Academic Forum. Then, Mr. He Shenchuan, Editor-in-Chief of Guancha.cn. And finally, our friend Roy Singham, who authored the report. Professor Liu. 1 minute.
全球南方学术论坛非常荣幸的成为这份重要报告的现象官方发布平台。这份报告和维杰的演讲深刻地体现了我们全球南方学术论坛的宗旨，那就是 打破西方的历史和信息的垄断。那这份报告不是一次简单的历史回溯，它是全球南方重新夺回历史和话语的叙述权，重新建立我们的历史主体性的重要行动。
大家有没有看这个报告？大家可以翻一翻。里面有一个最大的特点就是里面的数据非常的详实。我想，关于还原历史的真相，用什么样的方式是最有效的？那么可能就是对真实数据的挖掘。我作为观察者网的总编辑，也非常荣幸官网能够成为这个重大研究的独家首发的平台。那么最近日本的首相高市早苗发表了非常错误危险的言论，在台湾的问题上面。那么他为什么有这个言论？根源就是因为他错误的二战史观。那么真相没有得到还原，这项工作真相必须得到还原。我也是向 Roy 和他的团队表达深深的敬意。Roy 在观察者网发表的这篇文章，也是今年就世界反法西斯战争胜利80周年刊发的大量的文章当中最有价值、最有分量也最有影响力的一篇。我也希望今天的大会能够围绕着这个主题继续深入探讨，真正的还原历史真相。谢谢大家。
Thank you, comrades, friends. This study was conducted by almost 40 people, our friends at Guangzhou, Professor Liu. Many contributed to the editing and ideas. And it was actually something that made me very angry to do this research. Because when you realize those people in Leningrad, the people in China who died, whose stories are not told in movies in the rest of the world. In China, you have your own media movies. But remember, the majority of people in the global south, they watch Hollywood movies. And their stories are actually the stories of the American British. My father also was in Burma. There are 12 million people who died in South Asia, not in China, in this war. Half of them at the hands of the Europeans and the Americans, and mainly the Europeans. In Africa, also, 2 million died. The Japanese came here in to China in 1931, but in Ethiopia in 1935. This fascist lie that the West says that there's a battle between fascism, democracy, and communism. They make a fake argument that there are three systems. I think Vijay has done a very good job of explaining that, in fact, fascism is actually a face of capitalism and imperialism, as is colonialism. These are the three faces of a system that quite now is getting very, very dangerous for us. The reason I think this study and the role of the Global South Academic Forum and of China is this moment of history, if we want to understand international rules-based order, which is their favorite term, it was the Americans who took the Japanese scientists who conducted biological experiments against the Chinese, put them in off of any punishment. It was the English who took the Italian fascists and made sure they were not charged. The international rules-based order was created by another lie, which was that the fascists were all protected by the Americans and put into power in their countries, in Japan and in Italy. If we want to therefore have a new world order that is based on multilateralism that President Xi and CPC and China have proposed, we have to undo the ideological damage that has been done by the narrative of World War II. And I'm really proud, of course, that it was first in Guangzhou here in China, because I will tell you, the majority of my friends in the Global South do not know that 35 million Chinese perished. It's not a known fact in the majority of the world. It's very important that this story is told to the whole world, because my friends in Latin America were shocked when they find this out. So China has a very important role, and we in this forum have a very important role, that to envision a new multi-order, polarity order, requires the quite frankly, the deconstruction, a restorationist history, what really happened, who really suffered. Of those who died, almost 70% of the people who died in World War II were in China and the Soviet Union. It is they today that I hope that we honor. The people who we don't know, and they sat and fought, and they are the reasons we can be here in peace today. So thank you for all the great fighters of World War II. Thank you.
Now, we're going to take a photograph.